All right, welcome everyone. It's lovely to see some familiar names and faces coming in and some new names and faces. We're going to jump right in and get started with our third IMBES Ask Me Anything session. So IMBES is the International Mind Brain Education Society, and our AMA series is the goal of it is to build connections among IMBES trainees, people new to IMBES, and non-trainee practitioners and researchers, and support the translation of research into policy and practice. We'll introduce ourselves. I'm Chris Simmers. I'm a PhD student at the University of Connecticut and currently co-president of the IMBES Trainee Board.
I'm Sarah Gilmore. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Connecticut with Chris, and I am the president of, no, I'm not the president. I'm the chair of policy and practice for the IMBES Trainee Board. So it's really nice to see you all. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. The sessions are recorded so that we can share them on YouTube later, and you can watch them back or share them with your colleagues. We'll announce on Twitter and eventually at some point on our website when that recording is made available. And for everybody who registered, you'll also get an email with a link to the recording once it's available. We have two ASL interpreters here today. We've got Liz and Karen. And the Zoom interpretation feature is switched on, so you can enable that as a separate window to see them if you need that support. If you're not sure how to do that, send me a message and I'll try to help. We are going to start with a 15-minute presentation from Kent, who's our speaker today, on his work. Then we'll have a 15-minute facilitated discussion led by Chris to kind of elaborate on some of the points that Kent makes in his presentation. And then we'll move into a 15-minute Ask Me Anything session with questions from you guys in the audience. So please write down your questions as they come up to you or pop them straight in the chat. I'll be collating those so that we can come to them at the end. And you'll be welcome when we come to the question session to either unmute yourself and ask Kent your own questions, or I can ask them for you if you prefer. So if you have any issues, please let me know, and I'll hand it back to Chris.
All right, fantastic. Well, we're very excited to welcome Kent here. Kent is a teacher specialist for leadership development in Frederick County Public Schools in Maryland. He works to develop impactful learning that is grounded in research for school system leaders and has previously served as a middle school history teacher. He's presented recently at conferences such as Learning Forward, as well as Research Ed US, and he's got a really interesting topic for us today, looking at how we build professional learning that sticks for educational leaders. So very excited to have you here. Kent, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah and Chris. Great to see everybody today, and always excited to talk about research and something that's near and dear to my heart, research in the educational field. As Chris mentioned, I work as a teacher specialist for leadership development in Frederick County, Maryland. So it's a medium-sized school district. We've got about 69 schools here in Central Maryland. And I'm hoping to share with you a little bit about some research that I recently did, and that maybe it sparks something relevant to your work or gives you context for something that you can use. So just to give you a little bit of background on myself and also on my research, so that you have some context into the study that I did and what prompted me to sort of conduct it. In my current job, I am a teacher specialist for leadership development. So in simple terms, that means most of my day is spent developing professional learning or delivering professional learning to our system's leaders here in Frederick County Public Schools. Those leaders range from everywhere from a executive secretary all the way up to, an assistant superintendent. And I spend a lot of time designing and delivering that learning as part of my role. A number of years ago, I had the ability to attend through work the Center for Transformative Teaching and Learning's Academy on MBE, or Mind Brain Education. And at this academy, we spent a lot of time learning about the brain and how it learns and how you can design learning that will really help learners to retain that information and to gain that knowledge. And so this learning that I did about 6 or 7 years ago, it really informed the way I do my job every day in the professional learning that I design. Just last year, I spent some time going back to finish up my master's degree at Hood College here in Frederick, Maryland. And for my capstone research project, I had to select something to really look at and to research. And I thought about my role in leadership and developing professional learning. I thought about the learning that I did about mind-brain education and the way the brain learns. And what I really wanted to discover were the things that I was doing in designing professional learning, were they impactful? Were they doing the things that I hoped they were doing for the learners and for the leaders? I think it's really important that we're working sort of from a common place of understanding on some of the terms and things that I'm going to mention. So you heard me mention, along with the Center for Transformative Teaching and Learning, mind-brain education. And so I think it's important we kind of start there and talk a little bit about what that is. So you can see the graphics probably a little bit small, but mind-brain education is really at this intersection that exists between psychology, neuroscience, and education. And really what it's trying to do is bring that research world and that education world together and say, okay, we know this from this research. We know this in education. How can we use these things together? How can we use how the brain learns to really inform the way that we teach, inform the way we design learning for students, or in my case, for adults? Because everybody has a brain, whether you're a child or an adult. And there are a lot of things that are very similar between those brains. I'm also going to talk about some really important terms as they relate to my research. The first one is metacognition. And a lot of times this is stating about thinking about one's own thinking, but really what metacognition is it's being aware of your own thinking as a learner. When you're learning, thinking things like, I know this, or I don't know so much about that, or this is connected to this idea that I've learned before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about metacognition and how I included that in some of the design of learning for adults. I'm also going to talk a little bit about retrieval practice. And retrieval practice, if you've ever used flashcards, and I'm guessing most of us have in our learning, that's retrieval practice, right? It's bringing back previously learned information to mind that you did with the purpose of strengthening that information. And then finally, the study that I conducted was really honing in on principals. In the past, principals were really seen as more managers of people, but that has really shifted in the last 20 years or so to becoming more a lens of instructional leadership. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about instructional leadership is this idea of the principals, organizing the learning and the teaching in their building, developing a mission for what that looks like, and managing the instruction of that building. So yes, they're still managers of people and facilities and those kinds of things, but they're much more than that. They're instructional leaders, and they inform the learning that goes on in the school. So this group of principals, the reason I selected them or made them the focus of this study is some of the challenges that principals encounter. And those challenges are things that I have to tackle when I have to get them to attend a professional learning and do some learning that they use. School principals are really working tremendously long hours. They work 60 to 70-hour work weeks on average. And as I mentioned, they're not only seen as managers of people and resources within their buildings, but they also are these instructional leaders who have to think about the instructional decisions that are happening in all of their classrooms. And even though they spend a lot of time, as I mentioned, 60 or 70 hours in their roles, only about 2% of their time is spent on professional learning, which means it's very, very limited. And this is learning that they're supposed to be doing to help build their capacity as leaders, whether in their management of others or whether it's instructional practices. It's still only 2% of the time that they're spending is for their own capacity. And while there is a good deal of funding for professional learning going on at the federal level, only about 4% of the funding from the federal government goes towards the professional learning for leaders. So their funding is very, very limited. So we have a limited amount of time, increased demands, a limited amount of funding, all sort of funneling into these needs for these leaders to do this learning under these challenges. But on the flip side of the coin, despite all of these challenges, school principals are really impactful in the way that they impact student outcomes, student learning. They're second only to teachers in terms of their impact that they have on student learning and student achievement. So we can use a low-cost investment in investing in better professional learning, more professional learning for principals that will have a high impact on the student end, which is really where we want to go in terms of a school system. For the study that I conducted, I had 18 principals that were part of the study. They just happened to be 9 males and 9 females. The majority of the study, or 50% of the participants in the study, were in their first 5 years on the role of principal. So they may have been an assistant principal before, but they were relatively new to the role of principal. And all of these principals completed an intervention that was a required intervention as part of their professional learning for the year. They completed 5 sort of self-paced professional development modules that were based on a book called Rosenshine's Principles in Action by Tom Sherrington that really looks at what are the best instructional practices that teachers use. And they completed these modules at a self-paced pathway over the course of about 2 months of time during their summertime. And within each of the modules that they did, I had designed opportunities for them to engage in retrieval practice or bringing back to mind what they had done in a previous module or previous modules. And there were also lots of opportunities to sort of reflect or engage their metacognition on what did they learn, how are they going to use that learning, how is it relevant to their role as an instructional leader. For the study itself, what I really wanted to see was if we purposefully include retrieval practice in all of the learning that we do, whether it's a self-paced module or a face-to-face professional learning experience, would it help the principals to retain their learning over the course of time? Because of course, when somebody learns something, you want that learning to be durable, you want it to last. And so obviously we're putting time and money and energy and resources into this learning, and we want it to last. I also wanted to see if we included opportunities to activate their metacognition through questioning, through retrieval. Would it allow them to use what they learn to influence their instructional leaderships back in their building? So would they take kind of what they learned in these modules and then use it in their practices as a leader throughout the school year? So one of the reasons why I sort of honed in on retrieval practice, as I mentioned, is it helps us to retain learning. Research has really shown that whether it's younger learners or older learners, it helps you to retain information over the long term. Unfortunately, most people, learners, really don't know what retrieval practice is or its benefits. And oftentimes they will resort to less effective ways to help retain their learning, like, for example, rereading information or highlighting as they're learning. So, you know, it helps to make people aware of retrieval practice because not everyone's aware of it. And there are lots of different ways that learners can do retrieval practice. And for this study, I used 2 different types of retrieval practice, which I'll talk a little bit more about. One is called cued retrieval, and another is called free response. When we're talking about cued retrieval, basically there's some sort of an external stimuli, such as pictures or words or sentences that cues the learner, oh, they've learned this or they've seen this before. When we talk about free response, we're basically talking about free recall. It means there's a stimuli or a question and the learner just has to respond. There's nothing to sort of stimulate the fact that they've seen this information before. So this is what it looked like in the retrieval assessment as well as the modules. On the left here, you have an example of a retrieval response, which is a sort of a free recall or free response where the participants had to remember 6 strategies for the third principle of Rosenshine's principles, and they had to identify as many as they could remember. But on the right, we have an example of a cued retrieval that they completed, which was a diagram by the author, and it shows how your memory works. And so the colored circles, they had to identify the labels for those. So they had a stimuli that was cueing their retrieval in this case. As I mentioned, the study really honed in on metacognition and embedding metacognition into professional learning as well. When we talk about metacognition, it's actually a trigger. A retrieval practice can trigger your metacognition. It can give you a check of knowledge that makes your brain think, oh, I think I've seen this before, but I don't really remember. Maybe I should learn about that a little bit more. Or I've seen this before and I do remember, and this is going to help me on this next task. As an adult learner, you're sort of metacognitively advanced in comparison to students. Adult learners can use sort of a range of metacognitive skills, and we're doing these things without really thinking about it. But sometimes it helps to trigger it and force the metacognition to happen. And that's what I was hoping to do in this study. And when adults are faced with new content, they use sort of a range of these skills, and they become very active learners typically. So in the study itself, with the principals, before they started their learning, I asked them some of these questions, on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar were you with Rosenshine's principles? On a scale of 1 to 5, how well are you familiar with sort of the research-informed practices that you would use as an instructional leader? And I asked them to think about what they hoped to gain from it. During the modules, they had little tasks like this, which asked them to bring back to mind examples of things that they had seen related to the content, and to think about, what areas of the learning they would explore more in depth. So these types of questions they were doing that were metacognitive in nature to help trigger or activate their metacognition. To look at the results, it was a mixed method study, so I had quantitative and qualitative data that I drew from. So they completed a retrieval assessment, which I developed, and it had information and retrieval practices that were coming from the 5 modules that they did. They were a mix of cued retrieval as well as free response, and they had to answer 32 questions. So all 18 principals that participate in the study completed this retrieval assessment. The other set of data that qualitative data that I gathered came from a focus group of about 4 participants. So these were 4 principals who volunteered to participate. And I had some semi-structured interview questions, and I asked them sort of about, the retrieval and how did you feel like that helped you to keep the information. I asked them a little bit about, how did you feel the learning influenced you as an instructional leader? Did something change? And I also asked them to kind of share a little bit about, were there any actions that they took based on the learning and the things that they did as related to the metacognition and the thinking that they did during the learning. And looking at the findings and what I discovered after looking at all this data, I found that overall embedding retrieval practice into professional development really has the potential to increase the retention of learning over a long period of time. Participants, I was pleasantly surprised to find, were able to retain 43% of the learning that they did. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's an F of 43%. But they had done the learning 6 months ago, and forgetting is a normal process. And so there really hadn't been anything in between that learning and the time that I gave the retrieval assessment to trigger that learning again, like you might want to do. So I felt like that was a good result. It was also interesting that I found that the cued retrieval using images really helped. Even though it was one of the oldest questions that they had done in their learning, more than half of the participants got all the cued retrieval questions 100% right, and most people got the majority of those. So that was a nice finding for that. Several of the participants in the focus group had shared that when they did a retrieval practice, it actually triggered their reflection and their metacognition, and they thought about previous modules, sometimes went back and read the chapters or looked at their got their note taking that they had done. So that was a finding that I had, that the retrieval was triggering their metacognition. So that aligned with some of the studies that have been done. And then participants said that they got the feeling that a retrieval practice was coming in the next module. And when they knew one was coming, before they even started the module, they would revisit the content because they anticipated having to retrieve again. So that helped to strengthen that learning. And then finally, a lot of the principals shared that they were modeling different practices that they had learned during the modules, and that the metacognitive practices encouraged them to think deeply about the new learning that they were doing, and that they were sharing different research-informed strategies with their teachers during the feedback process when they would go to observe a lesson and give a suggestion of ways to kind of improve the instruction and the learning that was going on in classrooms. So I know we're going to move on to a little bit of questions, but if you don't get a chance to talk to me, or you want to learn a little bit more about some of this work, or want to reach out or just connect, here's some of my information. And I know I put together some resources for the session as well that will get sent out, and it has my contact information on there. So I'm going to stop sharing and get to the good stuff and hear what you all have to ask.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we've got some prepared questions, but please, people in the audience, put your questions into the chat as well. And Sarah will keep an eye on that to make sure that those get voiced as well. But Kent, our first question is, what has been the most impactful change that you've seen arising from the work that you do?
Sure. I think for me, like when I think about that question, one of the things that I tried to do in my work is to create a model. All the things I'm talking about are done for adults, but the hope is that the adults who are doing the learning will see that model and realize this works well for students as well. So I've seen retrieval practices being used with students throughout our system. I've seen other professional learning sessions that are embedding retrieval practice. So I think for me, that's been the most fulfilling part of it, is sort of people seeing, oh, well, this works for me as a learner. Well, this will work for the other people that I'm teaching, whether they're students or staff or other members of the school communities.
Yeah, fantastic. And retrieval practice is a great example of something that has been so well supported by research for so long. And yet you mentioned a lot of administrators or teachers may not have heard of this. So do you have any ideas, or what do you think might be a reason that translation from MBE research into practice might be so challenging?
I think it's the hardest part in everything in education, regardless, and I've seen this throughout the course of my entire career, is time is the #1 factor in everything in education. So you have all these competing interests, these things that are sort of tugging at you. And sometimes it's also access, right? So, you know, within our school system, we have the time constraints that every teacher or educator or leader is going to have, but we have a lot of access to resources. And I think as you know, as people realize there are lots of free things out there and they just need to find them, I think in the mind-brain education space and the educational research space, there's lots of things available to people, but they don't necessarily have as time to explore them. So sometimes in my role, I try very hard to be a curator of those things. I try to sort of give the small wins of those kinds of things to teachers. I do act as a sort of a research conduit within our system as well, to share research things. And there are lots of great things out there that people just aren't aware of it because they don't know about them, or they don't have the time to find them, or things of that nature is my experience.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we have two more questions for you from us, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. But in speaking about time limitations and things like that, it kind of leads into our next question. You mentioned that you try to act as a curator, providing research to teachers. What do you think is needed to best support teachers in implementing MBE research in their classrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I think for that, it's exposure. It's things that are very sort of accessible. You know, as a researcher, you spend a lot of time pouring through studies and things like that. And with that time element, a teacher might not have time to spend looking through studies. So I think just making things really accessible. I think there's a lot of great resources out there from places like InterDrive or the Learning Scientists, or I noticed Edutopia really picking up on that end a lot too. So there's lots of places that teachers are already going. And sometimes it's about getting that research informed MBE stuff in those spaces where teachers are already going and getting that exposure. Because ultimately, it's a lot easier to go on Teachers Pay Teachers and pay $1 and get something than it is to read a study and to inform the worksheets and the lessons and the things that you're going to do tomorrow. So if we just get things in the spaces where teachers are going, I think that will really help.
Fantastic. And one of the really great things about the IMBES community is that it really does bring teachers and researchers together. So we've talked a lot in this session about how teachers can benefit from research. Would love to turn that around and think from your perspective, what would it be helpful for researchers to think about? Or is there anything that you think would be helpful for researchers in this space to focus on in their work?
Well, I'm a little biased in that I'll say metacognition, but the reason I say that is because it doesn't cost anything. And I feel like, you know, there's been enough research into metacognition and there's lots of it. But what I think teachers really need is, how do I do that in my classroom, right? How do I every day help my students become metacognitive in their abilities, right? How do I grow them? So I think that's time well spent, just because, you know, if I were a teacher and I wanted to improve my students' learning, that would be an easy win for somebody to teach me a little bit more about how to do that. And I could do that tomorrow and it wouldn't cost me a thing. Asking better questions and setting better checks for understanding and all those kinds of things, I think is time well spent for research.
Fantastic. And right on time, I'll turn it over to Sarah, who's been curating quite a list of questions for you. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
great.
Several questions, and I'm trying to put them together into buckets so that we can keep them together. So we have a question from Caitlin, kind of following on from something that you just started talking about with Chris. And so I'll encourage you, Caitlin, to unmute yourself and just elaborate in case you feel like this doesn't cover the wholeness of your question. But in terms of tips that you have for encouraging educators to change and update their practice. So you mentioned, you know, making research more available to them, making the information easier to access. Is there anything else in that, in terms of what it takes to actually make a change to your practice for teachers, that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation in our system we have a lot, you know, and there's lots of research to say that even just hearing that something is a practice we need to change isn't necessarily always enough to change that practice. And I think they just need to see evidence and be willing to try things. And I used to work in advanced academics for gifted and talented learners, and it was challenging as a specialist in that to get people to go in and do something for those gifted learners that took more extra time or work and thinking for those specific types of learners. But what I found changed practice is like a collaborative effort, working together to build that lesson. You know, having a conversation around, you know, here's what I tried, it worked, it didn't work, what's a possibility? What does research say might work in my context? I think like that's the big thing, like it might work, right? You might try something and being willing to throw a lot of darts at the dartboard and try different things. But there's great research to say these things might work. Let's try them. And I think the biggest thing from that role that I used to say, and I still believe it with this work, is it's like one thing, not 20 things. Like in education, we have time to really hone in on one thing. And so that's why when I say metacognition, right, like that would be the one thing that I would hone in on, because it's easy, it's cheap, and we know that it works because we all use it. We're just not aware of it, and it's building that awareness. So I hope that answers the question.
Caitlin, do you want to add anything to that in terms of if you have any kind of specific experiences of working with teachers that have been a struggle that you want to see what Kent thinks?
No, thank you. That was really, really helpful. I just think that it is challenging to encourage like transformational change, but I think, like you said, focusing deeply on fewer things, like just focusing on metacognition or retrieval practice is a good tip, going really deep instead of trying to change everything at once. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in general, and educators can relate to this, like there's always a new shiny object. And sometimes the things we're suggesting are old things that we've known have worked for a long time. And it's just thinking about them more deeply, like you said, is the way to approach it.
So a couple of questions about, or rather a question and a comment about kind of specific MBE strategies. Tom is happy that you're biased about metacognition.
Thank you, Tom.
Rachel is wondering whether anchor charts in a classroom would be considered cued retrieval, and what would be some other examples of cued retrieval?
So like, I know for anchor charts, the hope is that we've learned this, you know, we can go back to it. So yes, a student could cue, oh, I know this, I've seen this from an anchor chart. It probably doesn't have as much desirable difficulty as we would want, because what we want to do is do a little bit of, have them do a bit of work. So it depends on, like if we could pull some of the things out of the anchor chart and or pull back at some point, right? Because by leaving the anchor chart there, they know that they have that scaffold, and eventually we have to pull that away a bit to increase the desirable difficulties. That would be my take on it. I don't know if anybody else, or if you want to follow up to that.
Sorry, is everyone able to hear me? I had a comment that it's difficult to hear me. Is it difficult? It might be you, Sylvia. Okay. So I have a couple of questions here about your specific study. So could you share a little bit more about how the metacognitive learning actually led to principals wanting to model instructional practice for teachers?
So all throughout the course of this learning that they did, there were lots of sort of nudges in that direction of that thinking. So a lot of questions about how would you use this learning in your instructional leadership? How do you, what actions do you want to take? Those kinds of things. So it was more a hope, I would say, that would lead in that direction, because the kinds of thinking that I was asking them to do during the learning involved them taking action. Now, this sort of data came from the 4 principles. So it's 4 principals sharing sort of their experience, and based on the 4 principals that I spoke with, one of the principals shared that they had taken Rosenshine's principles in action in the learning that they had done, and they had built their entire professional learning for their school around that book. So that was a big leap in that particular direction. Another principal shared that they had basically had some new assistant principals, and they had some conversations around it together, and how could they use it at the school level. And then another principal had in that focus group had shared that they were observing a lot of their newer staff and sharing instructional practices from the book when they saw something to help with questioning, or something to help with feedback, or something to help with retrieval. So that's the evidence base that I have to know that answer.
I'm sorry, I cannot, was it who asked that question originally? If you want to add anything to it, please feel free to unmute yourself and clarify or add.
Yeah, it's Pam Klinkenbeard. And I was just curious, asking principals to engage in metacognition wouldn't necessarily lead them to model. So I was curious about the mechanism of how one led to the other.
Yeah, so obviously when you're talking about instructional practices and you're exposing them to those, that's the hope. And the specific questions that I asked as part of the focus group talked about, how did the metacognition show up on sort of on the other end in terms of your instructional leadership practices. So it was a very structured question that got to that bit of knowledge.
You kind of nudged them, you said, in that direction.
As part of when I developed the modules and the learning initially for this, I did not have this study in place. So Dr. Hiller, Suzanne Hiller, who's in here with me, is my professor, and we talked a lot about what were some potential projects and some ideas. And it wasn't developed with this in mind, but it led enough in the sense that I was able to utilize this learning for this study itself.
Thank you.
So I would say that's a limitation too, right? Because it wasn't designed with the study in mind.
Sure.
I selfishly have a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
Jumping in. I was just curious because I tend to think a lot about the importance of leaders on instructional outcomes, also from the lens of the culture that they create in the school, their approach to leadership, and how their beliefs about what's important in learning and teaching influence the school as a whole. And so I guess I'm just wondering, what role do you feel like buy-in plays in the efficacy of your intervention or in the findings from your intervention? Because I feel like there's a difference between learning and retention of information and kind of sustained application of that information in a way that really is about kind of growth and making a change because you believe in it.
Yeah, so two of the principals, in all fairness, said, I did the modules, I checked a box. And now that we're sitting here thinking about it, I'm really having to think a little bit harder about how that showed up on my end. And then two of the principals had been using it extensively. And then there were a number of folks who did exactly like one of the principals in the focus groups and took that and made it a school-wide model. And obviously none of that was required or intended. So I think, when I initially designed the learning piece of it, the hope was that it would catch fire, but there were lots of folks that didn't see the value. And then some of those principals shared the reason I didn't do more with it is because nobody told me I had to. It wasn't required. There wasn't sort of this expectation that I do anything with it. So it was supposed to be sort of organic. And the hope is that it would catch on, but it only grew organically some places where that principal nurtured it, saw its value, as you said, Sarah, and felt the efficacy behind it was of value to their staff and what they needed.
Do you feel like there's a place for that kind of thinking, like in MBE specifically, beyond kind of metacognition and strategies and things like that? Is there a place for thinking about beliefs and values and what it really takes to embed something within MBE, or is that kind of something that has to work in collaboration with MBE?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, people who were doing this didn't necessarily even know that they were getting MBE or that I wasn't necessarily clear or in telling them exactly why we were doing, so I think showing the purpose and the science behind it may have caused more buy-in, because people know that retrieval works, they use it, but they don't always know why it works. So I think like Pooja Agarwal does a really great job of sort of explaining that in terms that we can all understand as learners.
At any point, if anybody wants to kind of jump in and add something or expand on the conversation, just feel free to unmute yourself or stick up the hand emoji. Tom, go for it.
Why not? Thank you very much, Kent. Thank you very much. And for the group as well. I came to the last one, and it was also very, very well done. It was very interesting when you talked about so many people that you've talked to who are not aware about metacognition. They're just really not aware of it. I understand that. It's interesting, though, if you say many of those same people are not aware of how the brain works. They really don't know. I didn't know that I had something up there until I had a stroke. And then for 11 months, and of course, I lost my language. I could not read, write, or speak well. So I spent 11 months thinking on the inside. Talk about metacognition. I was thinking my way through all of this and began to realize how the brain works because I was actually there to watch how my brain was working. And as I got better enough to read, and then better enough to express what I had now begun to learn more about, I began to realize that when you think harder, now I'm going to one of your questions, when you think harder, you are learning, but below that is what you are doing is creating more what we call, a person with stroke and aphasia, you're creating more C's, more connectivity, more C's, more synapses, because the cells that you and I both have, you're not going to grow new neurons, but you are going to grow new dendrites and synapses, metaphorically, the branches and leaves, and all learning happens at this synaptic level. That's the learning field. So you can grow, and you will, and we are, and all of us listening are growing new C's while we are having this conversation. So it's all about the C's. So here you go. Know a little bit. This is one thing to remember. There are more C's, and it's all about the C's. So when you think harder, and people say, I have to think harder. Well, just tell them, well, you know what happens when you think harder? You are growing new C's. And they go, that's what's happening in my brain when I do that? Yes, you're converting the activity you are doing, the cognitive activity, the thought activities, converting into new brain matter. Just like photosynthesis converting light into green leaves, plasticity converts thought and cognitive activities into new brain matter. Tell them that one time, write it down, and remember that, because they will, because everything you are talking about, behind that, I'm watching you doing this, say, yep, he's doing this stuff, he understands this stuff, and you just have to share these little bits, and they go, oh, that's what's happening. Because I had no idea. I had no idea until it happened to me.
Yeah, that's super fascinating, Tom. When I was digging into some of the research on retrieval, a lot of the research on retrieval is actually done with people over a certain age who have, cognitive things going on. And most of the retrieval research done at a learning level is either done with college students or students in the classroom. So it was really hard to find anything that wasn't along the lines of what you were talking about in terms of adult retrieval. People weren't really using it in professional learning as a way to sort of retain. It was more, if somebody is a dementia patient, how well can the retrieval help them? Or, yeah, I didn't see any stroke research, but I'm sure, based on what you're describing right there, that totally aligns with it.
Yeah, I do a class called It's All About the C's for people with stroke and aphasia. But I'm now doing it for people who begin to realize it isn't just about a person whose brain is injured, it's brains who want to learn something new. It really uses the exact same techniques, the same everythings, and it's all about the C's. But thank you very much. I do appreciate your talking and your explaining, and I got your email, so I'm very happy.
Absolutely.
I think you can look out for something in your inbox pretty soon, Kent.
All right. I welcome it.
I just want to honor the time because we do try to keep these to 45 minutes. So we understand if you have to go, but I can speak for myself. I'm happy to stay in here until 12 o'clock if anyone has any follow-up questions. Kent, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. This is really helpful. And everyone, we hope that you're able to join for our next one. We have a guest from Belgium. Sarah, do you want to I should know how to say that last name, but he told me don't even try. It's Pedro. So.
I thought you knew how to say it. I'm saying Broikery. I feel like that might be right.
Anyway, we're very excited. So hope to see you there Monday, the 10th of July. And also, if there's anyone that you would like to see, please, you can put in the chat now. If there's any guests you would like to see invited, put it in the chat or send us an email. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Kent.
Well, and anyone who wants to hang around, I have another question.
I'm hanging around.
Shall we stop the recording?
Let's keep it going for now. I mean,
Okay.
unless, I think that it's nice if we can have to share this part, unless anybody wants to talk about anything that they prefer not to have recorded, then please do say and I'll stop it. But
well, I'll jump in on the synaptogenesis real quickly, because that's also something that not only I would tell my kindergarten students that my kindergartens knew about. I didn't call it the C's, but they knew that when they were learning, it was growing new connections. And I just finished a pilot study on graduating master's in education students, and they were very unsure as to whether or not new learning meant new brain cells. So
Yeah.
So that's not information that we're equipping our teachers with. And I would agree with Tom anecdotally that it can be really empowering to understand what's happening when you're learning. One of my perspectives is if you understand neuroplasticity and that all brains have the ability to make connections, then when you don't know something, it's an opportunity rather than a deficit. So I would use that language with my kindergartners, like, oh, is this a new connection for you? Rather than, oh gosh, you don't know. It's like, ooh, like we're about to make this happen. So yeah, and there is neurogenesis, especially in the hippocampus. Wendy Suzuki does great work about she talks about growing a big, fat, fluffy hippocampus through lifestyle things that can encourage the hippocampus to continue to grow over time. The most evidence from the hippocampus might be because it's studied the most, not because that's the only place it's happening. But the key takeaway that, like, yes, your brain can grow new neurons, but that's not what's happening when you're learning. When you're learning, it's the synapses.
I'd be happy to send you a video that I use with my classes for your kindergartners. It's a video of on inside the brain, looking at various cells that are growing dendrites to make connections.
Yeah,
So
it's so cool.
You get to watch that. You've probably seen it before.
Yeah, I've used maybe similar with the kindergarten students I used to work with. Now I work with undergrad and graduate students. Same thing. I tell them the same thing.
Exactly. Oh, exactly.
I've got a question here from Rachel. She's a pre-5 librarian as well as a PhD student. Kudos to you. Searching for children's picture books to share MBE concepts. I found some, but not as many as I want. Any recommendations?
Oh boy. Well, none that jump to mind. I know we have celebrated Brain Awareness Week here in FCPS in our system, and I know that we have partnered with our local library system, but I don't remember specifically any books that were utilized by the media specialists. But the Dana Foundation had given a lot of free resources for the Brain Awareness Week when we used to do it here that we could use with schools. And I know that they had some really great resources that were kid facing. Looks like Chris has already got a link up there. So
I've been looking. So
one of them. I saw something good in the store the other day.
the one that I just did, sorry, it's a quick link to how your brain learns to read. It's based off Stanislas Dehaene, I think it's pronounced, a French neuroscientist. It's very accurate and very accessible. And the short answer to your question is no. I don't think there are many children's books that specifically relate to MBE concepts, but there are a few that talk about the brain and learning in helpful ways. A lot of people think of like Your Fantastic Elastic Brain. There's one by Dr. Kripa Sundar. I'm looking for that one now. That's made for very young learners. It's just called like How Do I Learn? I believe.
I think it is called that. Yeah. I know Crippa, she's fantastic. So that would be a really good one.
You know who ought to write such a book? Tracy.
Right.
Oh, Dr. Tracy Takuma Espinosa? Well, yeah, so
Yes.
one of the books that she has coming out is what kids want to know about their brains, but it's intended for adults. I've had drafts in the works, but they kind of got relegated to the list. But anybody who has good kids book recommendations, please put them in the chat, and we do we do take notes and send them out with the recordings for any resources that are shared.
Yes, and if you don't have time to put them in the chat right now, or you can't remember them right now, you can email Chris or I, or respond to us on Twitter, and then we can add them from there as well, because it may be that you can't think of them at this exact moment, but you can reach out to us and we'll add it.
Sure.
Any last minute questions before we set everybody free?
Yes, I sent the chat to Kent. You went to see TTL. Does anybody else from your whole system go on a regular basis, or does Glenn come over and teach with your groups, or all of it?
Yes, and yes. So we're a partnership with the CTTL. We've actually done a case study on our partnership with our district. And there's some more things coming along the lines of that partnership. This year, we're acting as a remote site for the CTTL. So it'll be like half virtual, and some of our teachers and administrators from will hold the site here where my office is at our Learning and Leadership Center. So yeah, and we've sent lots of folks over the years. We're well over 100 and some teachers. And then Glenn, it's about 30 minutes away from where we are. So it's an easy partnership in that way.
Okay.
Yeah, they're just the county below us. So.
Oh, great. Because you mentioned, or somebody mentioned about the shiny object and only really working on one thing. Well, I think the one thing is immersion. The brain is immersed within the skull. We have to learn that way. We have to just be immersed about plasticity, so that from Chris's kindergartens all the way up, just learning, just living and understanding how the brain works when it comes to the C's, then there's no longer so many. I know there'll be lots of shiny objects for everybody, for all of us,
Yeah,
but
the one we need to start with.
Keep doing what you're doing, and it's great that you're doing what you're doing. That's more immersion than just having one class and that's it.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. And a special thanks to Karen and Liz for being our interpreters. We really appreciate you. And thank you, everyone, for making the time to be here. And we hope we'll see you next month. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Kent. Bye.
Yeah.